3 or 4 years that there's not really anything that was reaching these inmates. And that you said that other than perhaps the religious perspective where you're trying to bring it, where they're bringing, quote, bringing forgiveness out of the realm of a lofty ideal, something that we kind of should do or could do, down to a grounded strategy. How do I forgive? What I'm trying to say there is, you saw something that was missing in prisons, and you did something about it.
Well, that is true. I did see, I did see a void there, and and I felt like I could make a difference, and that's where I felt called to respond. And forgiveness is a very significant part of that. It's part of a larger curriculum, and as you mentioned before, in emotional literacy, it explores, who am I really, and how do I manage my emotions, and as I often say, how did I come into the world this beautiful, amazing being filled with potential and end up a drug addict and possibly in a life of crime and end up in prison? What happened along the way? So the prison population is, to a large degree, not as a way to excuse their behavior, but is a traumatized population. They've had a lot of early trauma. And how do we help them really heal? Because unless people do that kind of healing, the anger, the shame, the grief, that's all unresolved. If they get out of prison and they haven't dealt with those feelings, they just go and do the same things they've done before to manage those feelings the best way they can, which is often leaves, victims in its wake, even if it's their family, their children, the people that, are most intimately affected by them, not to mention other people as well. So anyway, I saw that need, and I thought, okay, let's see if we can create a program that will speak to these people and begin to make a difference for them and help them to see that here's this opportunity. Here you are. You're not distracted by, for the most part, having to go to work every day, although they might have prison jobs. But, here's this opportunity to really do some deep healing work, even in this environment. And many people take advantage of that.
Well, Robin, the golden rule of houses of healing, I could ask you what it is, but I'd rather tell you that I know what it is and then have you talk more about it, make it easy for you. The golden rule of houses of healing is be gentle with yourself. And I guess got to tell everybody, over the last 4 years, you have been so kind to me. From the first day that I met you, and I call it a drive-by shooting. That's probably the wrong term to use with our population here. But when Frank Ferguson connected with me, I got led to him, and he and I had an hour conversation one day. I was in Boston with my son was in college up there, and I was driving out of Boston, and I talked to Frank, and I had wanted to meet him, but his schedule wouldn't permit. And at the end of the 1 hour conversation, I said, so what do you think about Right Thinking Foundation? And he said, well, Steve, if I was 40 years younger, I would want to do what you're doing myself. And that was like an ultimate compliment. And then he said, I want to introduce you to Robin Casarjian. And then he sent an email through a couple people that got to you, and he requested that you give me your program, your curriculum, your workbook, your DVD teaching series, and I started getting absorbed in it. Well, and being gentle with yourself, until I did some of my research, I didn't really know that that was the golden rule. I picked that up from this weekend, but here's why I bring it up. Robin, when you've talked to me so many times over the last 4 years, you're always loving, caring, encouraging, and you always say to me, Steve, be gentle with yourself. Take care of yourself. Because I go through a lot of stuff. I've shared it with my listeners for the 18 shows, and I never knew, though, that was the whole program. But what I want to continue to say about you and lead you into something here is, Robin, forgiveness, the way that you embrace it, it's your whole life. It's not just a case-by-case example. And you live a life of forgiveness where all the things you teach on forgiveness is your attitude toward everything. And that's what's so beautiful about it. It's not a choice each time, shall I or shall I not. And you talk about sometimes forgiveness is, you don't have to do it right now and if you don't feel comfortable. But would you talk toward that type of a idea?
Sure. When I talk about forgiveness, I always like to say a few things about what forgiveness is not, to clarify it for people, because oftentimes people feel like if they believe what it is not is what it is, it will stop them from even entertaining the possibility for themselves. For instance, forgiveness isn't pretending or ignoring your feelings and acting like everything's fine if it's not. So if you feel angry, then you need to honor that and acknowledge that. And it's not acting like you've forgiven when deep down you're feeling resentful, or it's very importantly, it's not condoning or accepting negative or hurtful behavior of others. It's not having to tell someone you forgive them, although you might choose to do that. It's not putting yourself in a situation where you could get victimized in a similar way in the future if you've been victimized in the past. It's not forgetting what happened. So I'd just like to kind of clarify that. But forgiveness really is... I like what Fred Luskin from the Forgiveness Project at Stanford said about forgiveness. He said, in any hurtful situation, the question is how much suffering you are willing to experience now from something that's happened in the past that you cannot change. He says that by forgiving, you disentangle yourself from an over-connection to the person. Forgiveness is taking back your power. It's a release from the negative power that someone holds over you. Oftentimes when we think about forgiving someone, we think, I'm not going to forgive that person after what they've done, as if by forgiving them, we're doing them a favor, not realizing that the person that we're doing the favor for is really ourselves rather than the other individual, although the other individual might be a beneficiary. And I love what Reverend Wayne Muller, who's written a number of books, said. He said, what we are forgiving, and this is so important in order to open up that possibility of forgiving in our lives. He says, what we are forgiving is not the act, not the violence or the neglect or the abuse or the insensitivity or the irresponsibility. We're not saying any of that is okay. He said, what we are forgiving is the people who could not manage to honor and cherish, in some cases, their own children, their own spouse, their own lives, the lives of others in a loving way. What we are forgiving is their confusion, their unskillfulness, in often cases, their suffering, and even their own desperation. So when people when people act in hurtful ways, those people in the time that they're acting in hurtful ways are not, I would almost say, in their right mind. They're not aligned with the core of who they are. And so they act out, and other people then get the brunt of that. So forgiving is really, in a sense, it's a decision and it's a choice to see the situation differently, rather than, they're acting that way and they're a jerk and I don't like them, or whatever. Just reacting just an automatic kind of reaction of what I will call the ego, the part of us that is habitually judging ourselves and other people. It's stepping out of that to that core of who we are, where we can see that, wow, that person is really separate from themselves. I don't condone what they're doing. I might have to take some very real and specific action in relation to them. It doesn't mean I don't call them on what they're doing, but I'm going to call them on what they're doing if indeed that's a choice I make from that clear, non-reactive part of myself where I can choose and speak to that clear, non-reactive part of the other person. Sometimes that speaking what I call from core self to core self, it can create bridges between us and another person. Sometimes it can't. The person is just too disconnected from themselves. But what we want to do is, what forgiveness does is release us from the negative power that someone holds over us. It's a way to become disentangled from like a kind of a toxic and unhealthy bond. So it's really, as I said, it's a choice and it's a decision to see the situation differently. I like how Dr. Jerry Champolsky says, who's written a lot of books on forgiveness, he says, forgiveness is seeing the light instead of the lampshade. And wow. I don't really, it's a great metaphor. I say I don't really necessarily see it as seeing the light instead of the lampshade. If the lampshade is there, if a person's being disrespectful or dishonest or behaving in a particular way. But if I'm seeing through the eyes of forgiveness, I see that lampshade in the context of the light, that there's more to that person than just the lampshade. When we're angry, all we see is the lampshade, and we're really relating from our own lampshade, our lampshade of anger and resentment, and so it forces us in a way to come back, or it invites us rather than forces, invites us to come to that part of ourselves where there is a clarity to really see, I would say, see the drama differently. We're willing to step back and see the situation differently, and that liberates us. Otherwise we get. Yes, go ahead, Steve.
Let me jump in just for a second, because in my notes that I have, true self versus sub-personalities. What I want to say here is that the other day when I was talking to you about this interview that's coming up, and I told you I was going to read your book again, and you said, "Wow, if you're really going to read that book all the way through, you'll probably know it better than me because I read it 25 years ago." Yeah. Well, let me do a Steve to you for all of those listeners that are enjoying the show today. This is kind of how Robin has to deal with me all the time as we talk. So, Robin, I read a book from this expert that is like the foremost expert on the subject of forgiveness this weekend, and it happens to be you, Robin. And I want to tell you something that I picked up out of it that I think is incredible, and I want to get you to talk about this for a second. When I said a few minutes ago that you live a life that's an attitude of forgiveness, where you accept people that they're all basically good. You try to help people get back to their true core self that they started with. One of the most dramatic things that I saw on one of the Houses of Healing videos this morning was it talked about from the child to the prisoner, or from childhood to prison, and you chronicled the tragedy of life where people come up through some awful home life. There was one example in there of a guy that was in your seminar that was being videoed that was a foster care, and he was raped by his foster dad and told not to say anything, and nobody believed him, and it was a tragedy, and it led to all that it led to. But you showed pictures of children between infants to 1 year, 2 year old, and you said there is not a single child that's born in this world